Hello and welcome. I am Tiberius, and today I'm continuing my interview series about getting into cybersecurity. I'm joined by Andrew Wilson, who has nearly 2 decades of experience working in application security. Andrew's career has taken many twists and turns, starting out as a software engineer before moving into pen testing, becoming a VP of services at Bishop Fox, and now doing independent research on AI and offensive security. Andrew is also a co-founder of CactusCon, an annual cybersecurity convention in Arizona. Andrew, welcome to my channel, and thank you for being here to share your knowledge and experiences with us.
Thank you for having me. Obviously, really excited to be able to share and talk through what it takes to sort of make a real career and get jobs in cybersecurity.
You mentioned to me that you grew up sort of immersed in computers and became a software developer because there wasn't really a big security industry at the time. How hard was the eventual transition to pen testing? And do you have any sort of general advice for those in similar positions today?
I mean, it was a long transition only because, at the time that I was kind of growing up in really about 1996, let's just say, there really weren't a lot of cybersecurity companies doing pen testing at kind of this top level. My father-in-law at the time was the owner of a software engineering firm, and he had kind of compelled me that, hey, you should go down this other direction because it's going to have a little bit more career opportunities for you, and you get kind of deeper knowledge of software engineering, right? And that journey from 1994 to becoming a professional tester, that was almost 12 years, maybe 13 years in the making, right? It took a long time for me to feel like there was enough cybersecurity companies, enough work in that space, and there really wasn't a lot of other opportunities to kind of move into it before then. Once I kind of made up my mind, the journey was actually pretty quick. My first sort of goal was, how do I leverage my current position to get myself a little bit more security adjacent, right? So I was a software engineer, and I started focusing on secure development lifecycle and started studying Microsoft SDLC. And then from there, that period of time probably took me about 6 months of real kind of study and work and effort to kind of go from full-time security engineer or full-time engineer into my very first pen testing job. Sort of accidentally, that job came about actually because of volunteer work I was doing. I was really excited about the sort of booming security scene, and so I went to what's the very first ThoughtCon in Chicago, if you've ever heard of it, and volunteered. I just randomly was talking to one of the people who was organizing it, and I said, look, I'm coming out. I'd love to help out however I could, and I took a position helping with registration that year. And from there, I met a bunch of people, and we got to talking, and it helped me get my very first job in cybersecurity.
Awesome. Yeah, I'm going to my first ThoughtCon this year. So depending on when this is released, that will either be in a few months or maybe last week. But yeah, so I'm looking forward to it. Yeah, it's Chicago is, I said this on Twitter the other day, actually. Chicago is a crazy city for cybersecurity conventions.
Yeah.
I think there's like 20 of them or something. It's kind of ridiculous, but yeah, I love Chicago. It's sort of my second home of sorts. But yeah, it's really good conventions there.
Yeah, absolutely. They have a really good scene, a lot of great people out there. I'm excited you're going to get to go to ThoughtCon. It's a really cool event. So
awesome. So during your 11 years at Bishop Fox, you've hired over 100 pen testers. What qualities make a candidate really stand out in your eyes?
Yeah, absolutely. It's really interesting. With Bishop Fox, when I was there, we sort of have this mantra of quality is customer service quality, right? And that delivering a high quality engagement is sort of this balance of technical skill and can it put you in front of customer, basically, right? And both of them weigh out to be really important, but also kind of like how you present yourself, how you talk to people, how you communicate, share ideas becomes a really big part of the interview process that kind of comes into stuff for us. At a technical level, we early on had this great idea that we were going to actually test people to see if they could do what they said they were going to do, right? And so we had a minimum bar standard. It was a web engagement. One of my friends, Joe DeMessi and Carl, put this together in a weekend, and it became sort of the basis of this rite of passage for our company where you have to meet a minimum security set of skills in order to pass it, basically, right? And it wasn't necessarily to like weed people out per se, but it was really to sort of look at how you think about your process, right? And then we could measure people fairly based off that, right? If you were a junior tester, what could we expect you to find? If you were an intermediate tester, et cetera, et cetera. And so because the work we did was so customer facing, having a good sense of what you could technically accomplish early on. I mean, this was before Hack the Box and before many of these things had kind of come out. And so we started with the technical piece, right? But from an interpersonal piece and from a communication piece, I would say like there's this curiosity and passion that I always love to look for with people, that they're out chasing sort of excellence in their own lives as they think about getting a job. They're at the conferences, they're putting together GitHub repos and they're researching things and they're kind of staying in the loop. And I've always appreciated this sort of hunger, right? And to the degree that you could bring that out in the interview is always to people's advantage, because I could help people learn the technical skills a lot easier than I could kind of motivate people and get them passionate for excellence and pushing on the security industry. To me, that's the harder thing to kind of do. But the technical pieces comes with time. It just comes with time and experience and having good mentors, which we had kind of the luxury of Bishop Fox.
You've got like a nice balance of objective and subjective there. So you have like the objective piece, which is the practical, which I know a lot of companies do these days, especially. So I've had a mixture of bad implementations and good implementations of practical engagements. But yeah, and then you've got the subjective side, which is that passion stuff. And that's, yeah, I definitely like seeing that when I interview people, for sure. Just getting them to talk about something, even if they don't, if they don't know the correct answer to a question, seeing how their brain works, especially, and having them like excited about going away and solving it after the interview is kind of a nice one as well.
Absolutely. I definitely agree on the technical piece. I mean, it's really hard because, you're asking people to give up some time, and that's a really big thing to ask of people, especially as you get like more senior. What we would find is people's time become a lot less willing to kind of participate in those sorts of things, and you want to do it in a way that's fair, that gives people this challenge, that kind of respects the fact that everybody has different positions. Like obviously a network security person coming into a web application test, is going to be hopefully results at some level, but that's obviously not their forte. And so if you don't take the time to kind of weigh that out in terms of how you build those things, you end up with a test that's, I'll call it unfair, but it doesn't measure what I think people think it's going to measure.
Yeah. And getting into the industry is obviously a major first step, especially today. But once you have that first position, your foot really can't come off the gas. What are your strategies and skills for long-term success in the field?
Yeah, I think that there's sort of two pieces, right? There's this idea of like, how do you get your foot in the door from a job perspective? And then there's this other undercurrent that says like, how do you build a career, right? My background is studying martial arts, both kind of classical and a little bit more sport. And you find that there's kind of these two ideas. Like one is you learn the scales and you learn this like very like fundamental rudimental piece that you sort of build on over time. And the other one is you kind of start with something practical and you go out and you fight, and you go out and you fight, go out and you fight. And I think for me, I lean a little bit more classical, meaning like if you want to do a career, let's say in incident response, right? There's a really big learning curve to how operating systems work, how reverse engineering comes into play, understanding assembly, understanding how the compiler creates what it's doing and the changes it makes to the code, et cetera. And if you don't take the time early on to learn that, it's one of those things where you kind of hit a wall technically, and you're going to get stuck until you kind of do. And so for me, it's like, what are those fundamental kind of facets of the thing it is you say you want to perform? Like for me, my background was application security. I loved it from my bones. I mean, I had 10 something years of experience building enterprise software, building web applications, not just like little hobby projects, but big enterprise things. And so taking the time to kind of learn how these things are actually functioning behind the scenes so that you could build that foundation that's going to kind of grow as you get deeper and deeper into that space. I think it's actually quite critical for long-term development, because otherwise, what I've seen is people, they learn it to a level, right? And there's nothing wrong with that. And then it becomes really repetitive. So then they move into the next thing, right? They go apps to like IoT to maybe a cryptology specialist, and they kind of move down this path. And there's nothing wrong with that, but you should think about those things as you're like planning kind of which way you want to go and what direction you want to get into. And for me, it's always going back to the technology. How's the technology really working? How do I go deeper into its underpinnings? How do I understand what it looks like? And it served me really well as a professional career to constantly look at the new things that are coming out, but really, how are they implemented? How are they working? What's the underpinnings behind it? It keeps you fresh, it keeps you current, right? That's one part of it, but it lets you kind of go deeper and see things that people who aren't taking the time to do that in an assessment don't ever see.
Yeah, no, I 100% agree. I always spoke, obviously, I'm an AppSec guy as well. I've always recommended people, if you're going to get into AppSec especially, go read some of the HTTP specs. You can start with the first one. It's really boring, but you can. It'll give you a nice sort of idea of how it's supposed to work, and then you can get into the more complicated stuff, because the HTTP spec these days is massive. But still, if you want to know how WebSockets are implemented, it's all there. And yeah, knowing that fundamental stuff is going to make you a better tester at the end of the day. So I've interviewed people who have tested web apps and couldn't adequately describe what the general syntax of an HTTP request looked like, right, which is kind of scary. Like they knew in their head what it was. It's not like they hadn't seen one before, but if it's a whole different thing if they can list off, get /HTTP, right? But like the rest of it, like the actual syntax of an HTTP request, is not an easy question to answer. There's definitely a few things you could make comments about in that answer, especially. So,
right.
Yeah, I like that question. But yeah, learning the fundamentals is very important.
Well, and it's also because, like, to your point, even though there is the spec, everybody has to implement the spec, and everybody implements the spec differently, essentially, right? Yeah. We like to think that everyone sort of follows that standard, but we saw, with Tangled Web when it came out, that every browser had a different sort of opinion on how to deal with the sort of squishy parts of the spec. Or in some cases, even Safari today writes its own HTML tags just because they want to have their own things in Safari that's literally not respected anywhere in any other browser. And like, when you get into, I'll just say like advanced exploitation, and you go kind of deeper down in that chain, like understanding those nuances, to me at least, have been so critical and important in the pathway. What I would tell people, and I'll call it a little dated, right, as a pathway, is I would first say start with the Web App Hacker's Handbook for sure. It's going to give you a really good fundamental of not just how to like think about and look at an HTTP request and the things that go into it, but it got you at least conversant in Burp, and you could kind of see that and work through it in the third edition, the last one. From there, I would point people into two books. I would say go read, obviously, Tangled Web, which takes you kind of another step into what's the browser doing, how is URLs getting parsed, what are the complexities that kind of come into it. And then I'm a big fan of I call it the TAUSA, but it's the Art of Application Security Assessment, I think is like the name of it, by Mark Dowd and some others. And it's a huge book, and I don't recommend reading all of it because most of it's like very dated. But there's the first 3 or 4 chapters of like how they do assessment. And those 3 or 4 chapters are like the epitome and the essential and the foundation of what I believe everyone should understand of how to perform, I'll call it a qualified review. And you don't have to like pick one or like one over the other, but you find out like this is where you're either doing bottom up, or you're doing data tracing from the top down, or you're doing some sort of candidate assessment. And I would work my students specifically through those sorts of processes, and then I go to the spec, start reverse engineering actual applications, go pull down some of the tools that you might be otherwise using, and look at how other people are thinking about it. And there's a whole world you can explore inside of that if you have the background in AppSec to go look at those things and see how other people are solving it, which is fascinating. I mean, I've learned so much about like SQL injection as an example, just by reading all the code from SQL Map, right? And how they would go about it, how they think about it, how it's processing the discovery of vulnerabilities, and then even sort of the iterative process of exploitation of it, But anyways, so that's what I mean. It's like, that's a long curve, and it takes a while to get people through it. And I think a lot of folks have gotten into a space where they're looking for a job, and that's not necessarily the practical way to get a job, right? Hack the box challenges, or learning about vulnerabilities, being able to answer things like, what are the OS top 10 and how do you manipulate it? Like, those are some of maybe the punchier things that will help you with job interviews, depending on where you're going. But from a long-term career, if you're going down AppSec, I think that's how I've thought about it historically, and that's what I've recommended to people in terms of developing a kind of a comprehensive understanding of the space.
Yeah, 100% agree with you as well on the SQL map stuff. Like, looking into that tool taught me so much more about SQL injection than I ever thought I knew. And I thought I knew a lot about SQL injection. I probably did. But yeah, there's just pulling apart that tool is awesome, especially because it'll also teach you how to, because you can edit the tool and, make it find particular instances of SQL injection, which it doesn't by default. Right. There's entire sort of configuration files deep within SQL map, which you can just add stuff to, and then suddenly it'll start finding things because it's not a perfect tool. There is no perfect tool for SQL injection. So, but yeah, if you have a weird SQL injection that you kind of know how to do it manually, but you want to make SQL map do it, there are definitely ways, if you understand the code, to edit SQL map for that.
Right. Or augment it in scenarios where SQL map can't work. Like, I haven't used it in a bit, but like cross-site request forgery anti-tokens within the post pieces used to booger it up pretty bad. And so like figuring out how to chain it so you could feed in the tokens and get around it. Like, those are things you can do if you take the time to go deep into it. And that's why that long arm becomes so important, right? I think what happens now, at least what I've seen in some of the boot camps and some of the trainings, is there's this like focus on, okay, here's a tool, learn the tool, get comfortable with the tool. And it's great for getting you familiar. And there's nothing like wrong with that. I obviously have, you have to learn them at some point, but learning how to solve problems and then learning how to look at the situations to help you solve those problems, that takes a time. It takes that background and technology to learn how to leverage it.
So it's not a secret that there are companies out there that don't really have mature hiring practices for cybersecurity positions. There are some that even take advantage of the sort of desperation of junior level folks just trying to break into the industry. What advice do you have for job seekers to evaluate the maturity of a company when they're considering applying?
Yeah. So for me, I've always told people, and I've always personally believed, that an interview is a two-way street. Right. And you're taking that opportunity to see if you want to work there just as much as they're taking an opportunity to see if you're qualified. And I think what happens, especially when you're junior, is you're just so like hungry or happy to get in somewhere that maybe some of those questions, you might ask yourself a lot more 2-3 jobs down the road. But there's no harm in like learning about who they are early on to see if you're going to be the right sort of fit for them. I actually pulled this up before our meeting, and I actually wrote some guidelines, right? Some things that I like to kind of ask people while I'm interviewing with them when I was more junior. Things like, how does your company measure quality? Right? What do you do to enforce it, or what do you do to support it so that you're meeting a consistent delivery across your team? Is it a framework? What's your process look like? Do you have quality review as the test comes out, somebody going back and making sure that, you don't have false positives, or checking some of these things? Like, what is the process you might follow? How do you support the training and development of your team? Right? Those sorts of questions, like, okay, if I was to come work here, do you have a training program, or how am I going to move forward in my own career? Like, what does that look like? Do I get assigned a mentor, as an example, which I think is a really good question. I like to ask people things like, how do you staff a project? Like, what's your thinking about project staffing? Is it whoever's available? Am I going to get paired with somebody who's more senior to me? What are my opportunities to grow? Because I want to fit overall into that process in a way that's going to make me comfortable. It's going to help me in what I'm looking to do as well. I like to ask companies like, who do I report to and who do they report to? I once did an interview with a job where my manager had like 4 managers, and technically I would have 2 managers at the same time. And it was like, I do not want to deal with that ever again in my life because it creates problems for you down the road. And so like, I genuinely suggest taking your time to think through questions. Again, you don't have to agree with me on why or what you value or how you value it, but you should take the time to sort of think through, how does this help you in the long term if you were to come work there, and what are they doing to support that process, and then build questions around it. That's sort of how I've thought of it. I will say from the other side of the coin, like when I'm doing the interviews, if a person was to have like come to the table and said, like, I researched your company, I researched Bishop Fox, and I'm really interested, like, how does this work? Like this, I was looking at your event, or you wrote a tool, and how do I work with that person, right? Like that interest that says, I'm not just sort of looking for work per se, but I'm interested in you enough to take the time to have thought about like what it is you're doing and how I might be a part of it. I've always appreciated it. I mean, it's something you'd be surprised how uncommon it is. It's not something that I'd say like it's like 1 out of 6 interviews has somebody stopped me and asked me real questions about my business, or the company and what they're doing. And I think it helps you stand out, right? I honestly think it helps you stand out when you push on me about those types of questions as well.
Yeah, and I'm interested in your opinion on this as well, because I've had people interview at companies which are clearly, let's just say, not great in terms of the culture, let's say, but they were offered a job. It was their first job in cybersecurity. They took it because, at the end of the day, it's a job. And if you stay there a year, you have a year's experience on your resume. So, like, there's clearly some kind of balance. You don't want to get screwed over at a company, but at the same time, if you can get, it's crazy. Like a year on a resume is worth so much at the next job that it's like sometimes it is kind of worth just, okay, yeah, it's a crappy company, but you don't really want to work there. But yeah, I don't know. What is your opinion on that?
No, I mean, I definitely agree. I think there's times where you just sort of have to gut through things. As long as you're getting real experience that you can transfer somewhere else, right? Yeah. I've met a lot of people who go the other way, right? And they've been in a company for a long time, like ignore the culture part, but they've done the same job for 2 or 3 years, and they get further and further away from the tech, but now they're senior pen tester, principal pen tester, and they've lost sort of their access to or insights that they might have had when they were hands-on keyboard doing the assessment, if that makes sense, right? And so like if you had a year in a place and you were just gutting it out because you wanted experience, great. Hopefully that comes along with, well, I also got to do some interesting engagements, or I also got to meet some interesting people, or I also got to build something in my resume other than, well, I came in and they just had me doing false positive reviews off scanners, or I'm, running Nmap. Because now, yeah, you have a year of experience, but you like, how is it helping you get to where you want to go? Or is that getting you to the next position? That's how I've always thought about it. Sometimes culture doesn't reveal itself until you get in, and you don't know, and it's like a surprise. But sometimes I feel like you could get a good sense for it through the interview process itself. I was talking to somebody else online not too long ago, and it was like, I've never interviewed somewhere where the whole process was excellent and people were great and everyone was fun to talk to, and then had the company be awful on the inside, but on the inverse, like I've never had an interview where the interviews were terrible, and then when I got to the job, it was anything less than the terribleness of the interview. You know what I mean? Like I've had like the red flags that go off about, people are interviewing you, don't even know what you're interviewing for. I have job ones in software engineering where I got offered a job, and the day I showed up, they transferred me to a new department and nobody knew, right? Like these types of things are, they're not just InfoSec problems, but like you can, and if you ask those sort of curated questions, at least you sort of know what you're walking into, I guess. So you're kind of eyes wide open. And that's why I think going back to the first point is it's a two-way street. You like really should take the time to kind of poke on that, because working for somewhere for a year where you're not progressing your own career as a result of it, obviously means got to pay bills, and that's going to take priority always, right? But if you have the opportunity or the luxury, should I say, of like continuing to interview in the field, you should do that. You should take it so you're weighing out all your options, not just one, if you can.
Absolutely. And there's a question that interviewers often ask in interviews, which is like, where do you see yourself in 3 or 5 years? There's no reason why you can't, if they don't ask that, turn around and be like, where do you want me to be in 3 to 5 years? If I stay at this company, that at least shows you if they have a plan for your development, right?
Right.
Like, so I feel like that's a good question for juniors to ask, especially because if they don't have an answer to that, that might indicate they don't really have a plan for anything other than, oh, you just be on pen tests.
Absolutely. And I think that goes back to, you were talking about maturity before, but there's a maturity of the firm in terms of what they see the actual group you're being hired into as, right? Obviously, internal teams versus a consulting practice versus, the hero of one in a company where they just need a security person, right? How they view themselves and the expectations they're going to put on you are going to change a lot of the trajectory that they could offer you. I've been in pieces as a software engineer where they wouldn't be able to answer that because they have no idea, right? They just need some developers. You're on a project, do the project, and then, it's on you to kind of figure out 3 to 5 year plan. I've also worked for consulting firms as an engineer, and they had very clear plans. And it was like, we want you to get certifications, and we want you to push forward, and we want you to progress because your progress means they get to go brag to their clients, like, look at this guy who has, whatever certification or has whatever thing. Like, ideally, if you get to pick, that's who I would want to be with, right? The one who's benefiting off of your progression that also supports your progression on the flip side. And you'll find that a lot of consulting firms, I think, do that, or they sort of support that. But if you go to a place where you're a team, a small team, and there's not really that sort of level of thoughtfulness, they may not even have an answer to that question. They might have never thought of it before. They're just dealing with, I got to do these pen tests, so I have to do this, whatever. And your progression is out of that team into something else or somewhere else in the company.
Yeah, no, absolutely. In your experience, how do soft skills sort of complement technical expertise in cybersecurity roles?
It's interesting about complement. I think when you talk about consulting, the expectation is you know what you're doing, right? You don't go to like a doctor and then have doubts that your doctor is qualified to be a doctor, right? Or hopefully you wouldn't. Right?
Yeah. Right.
So there's like this minimum set of expectations at a technical skill that are, table stakes, right? Like, what does it mean to be in that role? Everything else that people perceive as quality is soft skills, how they're treated, how you go to a doctor, how they treat you, do they make you wait in the office? How does your office staff make you feel, right? And if you can learn that early on, learn how to communicate with people, learn how to share ideas, not just from a perspective of, engineering, like glory and nerdiness, but like meet people where they are so that they can understand it. It's like when you get into security engineering for pen testing, I'll just say, you're going to be in this space where that's all you think about. That's all you look at. And so there's so much that's like obvious for you, but then your customers may not know anything about half of the words that you're talking about. And frankly, some of our words are so weird and silly that like, you have to learn how to meet people where they are and kind of communicate and share that back and forth. And so soft skills like how to write a report, how to communicate clearly, how to take aggression out of your tone, because if you're talking to someone about an engagement and you're telling them like, oh, we messed you up and everything was ruined and your whole world is over, like that might be how you see it, but that's probably not what you want to tell someone who's, baby you're telling maybe isn't the most attractive, right? Like you've got to kind of like, you kind of have to measure the way that you push that out, right? And so that's the part of soft skills, I guess. I think that makes such a big difference in the long term, especially as you move into a space like consulting. But in a way, it's a part of what pulls you into higher levels of seniority over time, because there's this expectation that you're going to work with or talk with customers or talk with people. You have to share those ideas out.
Yeah, the point about aggression is really important. I think being able to read the person who you're giving, like if you're presenting a report in like a readout call, being able to read the attitude of the room is so important, because I've had instances where like I found a ton of stuff on an application test, and I've had calls where the dev team have been really annoyed. So I've had to be super cautious and and approach it from a like, well, here's how you can improve and here's how you can fix this stuff. And, this, it's okay. We find this a lot sort of stuff. And then I've had calls where the CISO has been on. They'll be like, well, you've had fun, haven't you? And then it becomes sort of like, okay, we can talk about this in a sort of jokey, sort of lighthearted way, I guess. Yeah. So it's incredibly important to sort of know there's no one way of doing a readout call, but you have to know exactly what if they're really annoyed at you or if they're just happy that they now know how to fix everything.
Right. You can sort of pregame some of that in engagements. And what I would tell my team is like, if we're in a situation where we're doing the assessment that's been forced on someone, you should almost always anticipate some hostility on the other side, right? Yeah. We've done things like M&A where our report actually changes potentially the valuation of how something is valued on a purchase or as a part of due diligence. We've done tests where, it's a compliancy, and if you fail compliancy, now maybe there's more work or more fines. And so like in all those cases, when your end customer may not be so excited about the work you're doing, you kind of have to tread with a degree of caution, right, in terms of how you do it. And I don't say like baby gloves, but like I did an assessment once with Spider Labs where we flew out to a place to do like a physical hybrid assessment where we're taking and dismantling a device apart and then testing it to see what we can kind of do type of thing. And this customer was like so nervous. I mean, they would follow us around the building and they would like sit in the cubicle with us and just kind of like stare at us to see like we weren't stealing anything. Like they were very cautious about it. And you have to have that, to your point, like empathy, but awareness, right? To have empathy to say, I know this is your first time doing it. I'm not here to like, make you look bad. I'm here to help you. I'm here to understand it, and walking them through that process as you kind of do it. And if you can go through that correctly, I mean, it's not always a guaranteed outcome, but my experience has been that like those are the sorts of things that really, really, really help in those kind of difficult situations that you might find yourself doing an assessment. So,
yeah, being able to diffuse the situation as well is important, especially if you have developers who see you as sort of the enemy. Being able to be like, you guys hired us. We're here to help. We're here to, yes, we're going to find vulnerabilities. We're also going to tell you how to A, fix them, and B, not make the same mistakes in the future, because nobody's perfect. So yeah, having good relationships with developers and trying to diffuse their sort of maybe defensive attitudes is important too.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's hard because like, one, you want to be excited about your work. And there's definitely this like feeling of like awesomeness, like look what I just broke into, look what I just did. But you got to measure that with how somebody's going to receive it kind of on the flip side in terms of where they are. And the second part of it is, especially when you've done this job for a while, there's this tendency to become very pessimistic because your job is to find fault with everything. And so like if you don't measure that a little bit with like, okay, here's what they did well, or here's how they did it well, or here's kind of how, they've done a good job, but there was a problem that wasn't theirs. Like part of it's about thinking through that too. So you don't approach it in a way that makes it feel like, they did a poor job or they did a bad job. Like some of that's just mental because you look at it all the time. That's what you stare at all the time.
Yeah, that's true as well. And yeah, like even putting some stuff in context, like, there are certain vulnerabilities you'll find in almost every single application. Right. And you can tell them that, like we do see this all the time. Like it's not just you. So giving context is always important to that kind of stuff. And especially if it's like complicated apps, super complex apps with like 20 different roles, there's bound to be authorization issues in there. Like it's not, they're going to be high or critical, not necessarily a huge deal if it's a massive application, like the fact we only found 5 of them, that's actually pretty good. So yeah, there's always contextual information you can give to developers to sort of make them feel better.
Yeah, it sounds like a degree that you can, though. I mean, like I've definitely had assessments where the whole point of the assessment was not just to do the test, but it was almost like to prove a point to the developer team. And there's always like a sense of hostility. And so, learning how to keep cool and not necessarily take some of those things personally becomes important. I've definitely had customers yell at me on the phone or engineers challenge and question everything. And so, you have to really truly be on point at a technical level so you can go back and say, here, let me show you because I have the evidence, I have the proof, but also like not get caught up in that when someone is angry that, you broke in or you did a thing, because they have to go live with the consequence of it, which may be, in some cases we've seen people get exited over some of the findings or some of the pieces that we've done over time. And, you don't get to control that. That's not on you. Just understand that like, there are reasons why some of the developers, some of the team might be hesitant or might be upset to share, because that's standard, right? It's unfortunately standard.
Yeah. Networking is obviously really important in the industry, especially, and you've created a hugely successful conference in CactusCon as part of that with your co-founders. In what ways can newcomers leverage networking to advance their careers in cybersecurity?
Yeah, it's a fantastic question. I will say, like, I don't think I've ever gotten a job outside of the network of people who have developed ahead of time, right? From a security perspective. Interviewed with a couple of places, but a lot of the ways that I got myself to stand out is sort of like kind of greasing the wheels a little bit, but knowing people inside of that company who can vouch for me. Obviously from a company perspective, whenever I hear a referral from someone on my team that I know, that I have trusted, and they say, hey, this person is really cool, you should come talk to him. That alone is such a huge advantage from a career perspective, just to get a foot in the door, just to talk with somebody, oftentimes maybe even the real manager in a place. I had an opportunity a little bit ago to apply for a job, and I reached back out to one of my coworkers who hooked me into the hiring manager, who I never would have talked to. I'd have to go through like 3 or 4 levels of bureaucracy just to look at my resume and just to talk to me and see if there was a fit and how to continue. And so, like, how you do that matters, right? A lot. And it shouldn't be like creepy. Like, I don't think you should like go places and be like, hey, I want to be your friend. Like, I think when you're really passionate about what, this industry, or passionate about a subset in it, like, the people, at least by my experience, they're so willing to be a part of that with you, and so willing to like share what they know, that the connection is real and it's fast, and it's because you have like this mutual love of something like problem solving or application security or network security or hardware or whatever, right? And that becomes such an awesome way to start to build out a broader network. Like I said, the first job I ever had in industry came from volunteer work, basically. I actually met a lot of people in ThoughtCon in Chicago, and I had applied for a couple of companies there in town, but it was really the group that I had met at ThoughtCon that became the way that I got my first certain job in industry. And from there, the next job I had was actually a friend I had in Arizona introduced me to the owners of Bishop Fox at a bar one time. And they were just hanging out, and it was like, hey, I was there and they were there. And it turned into kind of this awesome impromptu interview because someone knew me and was willing to vouch for me and put me in the kind of the front line and say, this is someone that matters. Volunteer work, I think, is the first thing I'd say. When I don't really know how it is, to be candid about DEF CON today, but like I showed up early to DEF CON when I first went out, like I think the first year or the second year. And I just help some people do stuff, help people move things, help people, because I was there and there was an opportunity and they needed hands. And it turns out that was like, Deviant Olem and a whole bunch of people in Tool. And, you get to meet folks. And now all of a sudden, like, they're like, hey, that was really cool. You jumped in, and you build this interesting rapport with people through kind of volunteerism at a conference level. At a local level, I mean, it's the same thing. Go to the user groups. Arizona has at one point, or had at one point, a really good community. We had, I know we still have a 2600 group. We have a DC 480 group. I've heard there's a DC 602 group. There's an OWASP group. There's a CISOs group, right? Like, there's a lot of things that are happening within the community locally where people are volunteering their time to share information. So, like, go there and meet them and get to know them. And to the degree that you can help with those things, like maybe you give a talk, or maybe you share something you're working on, or share some of your research, those ways start to build inroads with everyone around kind of town, and you could kind of build out and build out and build out from that end. And it's been hugely important in the way I've run my career, is just going out and sharing, going out volunteering, going out and participating, and that's always served me incredibly well.
Yeah, and you've kind of sort of hit my next question as well, which is mentioning all the kind of local groups that we have these days. There are so many security conventions these days. It can be overwhelming to know which ones are even worth attending. So I was wondering, do you have any advice on finding the best cons for you while also trying to avoid the fear of missing out?
First, I've always thought about it sort of regionally, right? If there was a reason I wanted to go somewhere. I mean, cybersecurity, if we kind of like go back to the beginning, it has definitely felt somewhat regional, right? Like when I grew up in it, if you didn't know people in that community, it was very difficult to get access to information, right? But there's always been a pretty good scene out of New York, a really good scene in New York, a great scene out of Boston. There's a ton of people and a ton of things in San Francisco. There's a really great scene in Austin, Chicago, and so forth, right? At some level, if you want to get into those spaces, going to some of those regions that have these bigger conventions and these bigger groups is definitely the first thing that I would tell someone I would put as a priority, right? I usually think like, what's the big East Coast conference? What's a good Mid-America conference? What's a good West Coast conference? And which of those makes the most sense for me to kind of figure out my time? But then also there's topics, right? Like, I don't want to go to a conference and then have it be, this very advanced thing that maybe I'm not actually that interested in, or there's a topical thing that I know I'm super interested in and I want to meet people in it. I just flew out. There's a conference out of Washington, D.C. called Comless, as an example, which is the intersection of all my security research. It's AI meets offensive security. And what a great group of people, right? And after kind of exploring it and looking at the talks online to get kind of a feel for what sort of they cover, I went out there and I flew out there and I made a point to be there. And I'd say like, that's the sort of research that I do. But again, if I have a network, I can also call my friends. In fact, I did just not too long ago and say, what's the most recent things that are going on? Like what's the community look like? How is it developing? What's sort of the bigger events? Which ones make sense to go to, sort of thing. And usually if you can make some of those connections, you could get a pretty good breakout of where you want to spend your time and why you want to go to them.
Awesome. So let's imagine that you're going to your very first cybersecurity con again. What would you do differently to maximize what you get out of it?
That's a good question. I think the first thing I would do is I build a plan ahead of time before I go. I feel like when I go now, sometimes it's like too late. If I don't have my sessionized and I plan out my day and I think like, okay, I'm going to go to these talks. And then have a plan B, especially for something like if you were to go to your first DEF CON, you might not be able to get into the talk, right? Because they're so big or they're so huge. And sometimes what you have to do is you have to like wait there a whole talk ahead of time to get in the line, to get into the talk you want to do. And so some of that comes with experience, but I would say have that plan ahead of time just so you can have a course of action, right? What is it that interests you? Talk to people in the hallway con. I think that's a big one that I would tell people that they should go after, is like, people are there to talk, they want to learn, they want to share. Start with the people whose kind of job it is, right? Go to the staff, go to the volunteers, ask them for help, and they'll typically navigate you around. But also don't be shy to like join in with people as they're having conversations. The very first DEF CON I went to, the line was amazing, right? If everybody goes to DEF CON, they know this infamous line. And I'm still friends with people I met at that line from the first DEF CON I ever went to. In fact, after I got my first badge, I was walking out and sitting in a restaurant and somebody invited me just to hang out with their buddies. And I've been talking to those guys for 13, 14 years later, right? So like networking is about sort of being willing to kind of reach out and say hi. Obviously, it's easier if you go with like a friend or you have people you already know ahead of time. But I would say don't be shy to try to make those connections, because they're so pivotal. Right? So they can really change the whole experience. And this is why volunteering becomes an easier way to facilitate that sometimes. Is like, because if you volunteer, you have a shared activity. You get to meet people. What am I doing? How do I help you? You're kind of on a shift and you get to talk to folks. And that shared function, in some cases makes it easier. You're not so like, outgoing that you want to walk over to a table and go, hey, can I sit here with you? Like, and maybe volunteering and getting to people there. Like, I didn't do enough of that. Even though I did a little bit of the first year, I didn't do enough of it until maybe my second or third conference. And I would say, like, lean in on it, right? Lean in on that as a way to make those connections.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And for DEF CON, I know there's the Lonely Hackers Club, which is a bunch of people who are going to DEF CON on their own and can meet up with other people in the club and hang out together, which is always nice because it's not volunteering, but it is sort of like forcing yourself to mingle with people who you don't know. Right. So that's always good. But yeah, there hasn't been a single DEF CON I've gone to where I've had a plan and have stuck to the plan. Like I'll be on the way to do a talk and I'll run into somebody in the hallway and they'll be like, "Oh, we're going to go here. You should come with us." I'll be like, do I really want to go to this talk or do I actually want to go hang with some people? So yeah, absolutely. Like planning for plan changes, having a backup for your backup is always good.
Right. At least know what the must-do things are that you want out of it, and then let the rest sort of be organic if you can. Like when I go to DEF CON, to your point, I don't even really go to a lot of the talks anymore. I spend most of my time in the villages. I just go to where certain groups are and try to learn more about a particular thing, or if it's a topical interest, I'll go spend a lot of time with that smaller group. And that for me is like just as useful as going to a bunch of talks, especially knowing, they're all going to be online in, a couple of months or whatever, you can just watch it. But yeah, having those like, I really, really want to see this thing and this is what I'm going to go do, you can at least have some opportunities for flexibility for sure.
Nice. So let's end the interview by talking briefly about your new passion, right? AI. So how do you foresee AI shaping the future of cybersecurity, and what ways can newcomers sort of take advantage of it to give them an edge?
Yeah. So first, anytime a new technology comes out, there's a huge benefit at a professional level from either software engineering or even just security engineering to become as conversant with it as fast as you can. Sometimes that won't play out because the adoption will be as big as some people think. But I saw it with IoT, I saw it with mobile when mobile became really big, and people build really great careers fast because, while there's sort of this uptick in use, your ability to kind of line up next to it and be relevant in that area also sort of pulls you into it, which is also, by the way, another really good way to get a job, right? Is to say, oh, I've done a bunch of work with AI and I'm a security person. Like that gets you kind of in the front door. To answer in terms of like where I see it being, I feel like it's like a degreaser. I was explaining this to someone yesterday. It's just like, there's so many things that I don't remember off the top of my head, right? I've done a lot of things. I don't really recall the exact way to do it. I have a bunch of notes that I can pull up. But it's also just this great convenience method to say, hey, take a look at this and tell me what I'm seeing. Or, hey, I need to do something really quick. I sort of remember how to do it, but, build it for me and kind of make it happen. So I see a lot of AI, at least in its initial use right now, working as this way to kind of like ease the mechanical connection points between activities. So it becomes easier to do things like possibly exploit dev, or building a proof of concept, or even understanding a piece of code you're looking at. I've seen people use AI to take like obfuscated code and just say, hey, tell me best guess, what do you think this is really doing if it was not obfuscated? And it does a pretty good job of learning and leveraging that to help you in ways that you don't necessarily have the access or time or skill sets on immediately. It's sort of at your fingertips that you can kind of touch this bigger, broader set of knowledge, which is powerful, right? I think it's really powerful. I'm interested in AI in terms of not just that, although I've been doing a lot of that lately in sort of workflowing out processes that help me do things with logic, reasoning, and helping me establish stuff. But for me, it's what can AI do for me that I can't already do for myself, right? So a lot of my research is on using data science to say, now that I can kind of do large scale, massive questions, right, on a thing, how do I use AI to support that so I have it more easily available to me in ways that wouldn't have otherwise been functional to do? There's a bunch of great projects in the past, like Jason Haddox did a thing. I want to say it was Jason Haddox. I know there was a couple of them that came out where it was like the probability of certain keywords showing up in a web scan as an example. So when you're doing like directory fuzzing, you could say, hey, these are the high likelihood, these are high probability based off of, a data set I pulled in from something like GitHub, or I pulled all the open source software and I was able to come up with like frequency analysis. That's great. And it's awesome. But the problem is keeping up with that, the rate of change, and being able to do it as this is like, it's so unwieldy that having something like AI that can actually do some of these things for you on the fly and build that index and curate it, keep it up for you, that's where I think, it should go, is doing the sorts of things that otherwise would be almost impossible to do it at scale. But now you can leverage the machine to apply that. And that's a big part of it for me. From a defense side, I mean, obviously it presents a bunch of problems for people who use it. And so there's an awesome opportunity from a career perspective for people to learn how to do prompt injection, or how to take advantage of these systems and use sort of their inherent, I don't call it weaknesses, but the logical squishiness to do things like jailbreak and get access to information, underlying data models, whatever. Obviously, there's a whole space inside of that that's really quite interesting. And I think those two kind of aspects are where we see everyone using it more or less today within the system, so within the industry.
Nice. Whenever people's feelings on AI, it's definitely here to stay. So it's definitely worth at least learning about, trying to use. I use it especially in pen testing, not for any sort of customer related stuff, but more, quick scripts that I could write on my own. I know I can write them on my own, but it's just much easier to get an AI to prompt it for me, So stuff like that is certainly useful for that. And yeah, especially as a newcomer, just experimenting with it, I think, is always good, because it is a new and emerging technology. The earlier you get in, the more you're going to have an edge over people, I think.
Right, especially for companies that have that as a real problem today. Just having someone who is passionate and interested in it becomes a really good game changer to bring them in early and have them help you with an implementation and do the research and the work that it takes to do it right. So yeah, I definitely think it's here to stay. I remember I had a teacher once say that nothing is more powerful than an idea whose time has arrived or time has come. And in my lifetime, I've seen that happen several times, like the internet as an example, like love it, hate it, whatever, you still had to respond to it because it wasn't going anywhere. And I think AI is going to be as big, if not bigger than that, because of its implications, and whether you like it or love it or hate it, I don't think it's going anywhere anytime soon. I think it's going to be the backbone. I mean, I'm truly excited about it as a security assessor because of all the things it allows me to do with greater ease than I previously took a lot more time and a lot more effort to go research and, pull out information that may be as simple as small changes and small modifications.
Well, Andrew, thank you so much for joining me today to share your knowledge and experience with us. Please let my viewers know where they can find and follow you online.
Absolutely. It's under my name on LinkedIn, Andrew.Wilson. You should be able to find me as under CactusCon if you kind of make those connections. And then I like to sit on Twitter and talk a lot of trash, but I'm on Twitter as Kazushi. It's Kuzushi. It's a Japanese judo term from when I did a lot of judo training and so forth. So you can find me online pretty much either one of those places right now.
Awesome. I will put those links in the video description for everyone watching. Andrew, again, thank you so much for joining me, and I will see everybody next time.
Thank you very much. I appreciate your time.